Russia utilizing cluster munitions on Ukrainian cities. In what could be considered a war crime, Russian military forces have fired cluster munitions into at least 3 civilian areas in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, on February 28, 2022, according to Human Rights Watch. These attacks killed at least 3 civilians. However, that number is expected to rise after the UN reported other attacks being conducted. Kharkiv is under relentless attack from Russian forces and civilians are hiding in basements to evade explosions and debris, said Steve Goose, arms director at Human Rights Watch. Using cluster munitions in populated areas shows a brazen and callous disregard for people's lives. Relying on multiple photos and 40 videos, the United Nations reported 46 civilian casualties, with 9 killed, 6 adults and 3 children, and 37 injured, 34 adults and 3 children. The 9 M55K submunitions were delivered by the 12-barreled BM-30 Smerch multiple rocket launcher system, MRLS, and each missile consisted of Russian-made 72 9N235 fragmentation submunitions. What are cluster munitions and how are they used? As Russian troops increase their indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas causing fear and panic among the civilian populace, the use of cluster munitions among the civilian population was clearly revealed. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg accused the Russians of using cluster munitions on Friday, calling them a blatant violation of international law. We have seen the use of cluster bombs and we have seen reports of the use of other types of weapons which would be in violation of international law, Stoltenberg said. Russian President Vladimir Putin denied that Russia is using cluster munitions against civilians and only against military targets, but the evidence was left behind everywhere. But first, what are cluster munitions? Cluster munitions can be fired from artillery, missile launchers, or be launched from aircraft. The container of cluster munitions then detonate in midair and release smaller bomblets that are powerful enough to kill a person or destroy a vehicle. Often these submunitions fail to detonate on impact, making them a danger if they are touched, long after hostilities have ceased. Some reports have up to 40% of cluster munitions failing to explode on contact. The news reports coming from Kharkiv and other large cities have documented numerous photos of the bomblets lying on the ground. Cluster munitions can cover a wide swath of areas, sometimes as large as several football fields. Stoltenberg said that NATO and its allies were collecting information and monitoring very closely what is going on in Ukraine. I also welcome the decision by the International Criminal Court to open the investigation to this because we have to make sure that President Putin, the president of Belarus, are held accountable for what they do, he added. This is brutality. This is inhumane. This is violating international law, Stoltenberg said. Human Rights Watch Arms Director Steve Goose said in a statement Friday, using cluster munitions in populated areas shows a brazen and callous disregard for people's lives. We are seeing mounting evidence of indiscriminate attacks on Kharkiv and the price civilians are paying for these serious violations, he added. If these deadly acts were carried out either intentionally or recklessly, they would be war crimes. Russia has also been accused of using thermobaric weapons or vacuum bombs against Ukrainian civilians. US Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield on Wednesday during an emergency session of the General Assembly issued a warning to Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Your leaders are lying to you. Do not commit war crimes, she said in her remarks that Russia was to begin using banned weapons. The Convention on Cluster Munitions banned the use, production, transfer and stockpiling of cluster munitions. It was a treaty signed by 100 nations and took effect on August 1, 2010. Russian military forces have used cluster munitions, a highly controversial weapon banned by many countries, against at least 2 civilian targets during its invasion of Ukraine, according to 2 international humanitarian organizations. 7 people died and 11 were injured in the bombings attributed to Russia, which has been known to use cluster munitions in warfare, possibly as recently as 2 years ago in Syria. Russian forces should stop using cluster munitions and end unlawful attacks with weapons that indiscriminately kill and maim, Steve Goose, Arms Director of Human Rights Watch, said in a statement. Once fired, cluster munitions open in midair and rain down dozens or even hundreds of smaller submunitions, or bomblets, over a large area the size of one or more football fields. The munitions are notoriously difficult to control, striking nearby targets indiscriminately, which is why international human rights groups say they shouldn't be used anywhere near civilian populations, if at all. A large portion of submunitions also fail to detonate on impact, as many as 40% by one estimate, leaving behind a trail of unexploded bombs that pose a secondary risk to people nearby. In 2008, more than 100 countries agreed to a global treaty banning the use of cluster munitions, but neither Russia nor Ukraine signed on. Cluster munitions hit a hospital and a preschool in Ukraine. According to Human Rights Watch, a Russian ballistic missile carrying cluster munitions struck outside a hospital in the city of Vuhledar, located in the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine, on Thursday. The group interviewed a doctor and a hospital official and examined photographs of the aftermath of the attack, which reportedly occurred around 10:30 a.m. local time. 4 civilians died and another 10 were injured, 6 of whom are healthcare workers. The hospital, an ambulance and other nearby vehicles sustained damage. I was on the first floor of our 2-story building. I heard a loud explosion outside. We ran into the hallway. Luckily, we didn't have many patients, said Natalia Soziura, the hospital's chief doctor, according to Human Rights Watch. We all fell to the floor. In a separate attack on Friday, cluster munitions fell on a preschool in the northeastern Ukrainian city of Okhturka in Sumy Oblast, Amnesty International reported. 3 people, including a child, died. Another child was wounded. Amnesty International said that Russian forces likely carried out the attack, since they were operating nearby and have a history of using cluster munitions, and that it may constitute a war crime. There is no possible justification for dropping cluster munitions in populated areas, let alone near a school, Agnes Kalamard, Secretary-General of Amnesty International, said in a statement. This attack bears all the hallmarks of Russia's use of this inherently indiscriminate and internationally banned weapon, and shows flagrant disregard for civilian life, she added. The group said drone footage showed 4 munitions striking the roof of the school and 3 more landing on the pavement outside. As more and more people are injured or killed in Russia's war against Ukraine, Moscow faces mounting allegations that it has used cluster and vacuum weapons, which can put civilians at increased risk, particularly when used in urban areas. International rights groups reported that cluster munitions apparently fired by Russia appeared to have hit a preschool in northeastern Ukraine and an area near a hospital in the Kyiv-controlled part of the eastern Donetsk region last week, killing several civilians. Russian forces, according to Ukrainian rights groups, also used cluster munitions in strikes on Kharkiv, the country's second-largest city and the center of intense fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces in recent days. Videos shared on social media show Russian launchers for thermobaric weapons, often called vacuum weapons, rolling down Ukrainian streets. A CNN team reported seeing a Russian thermobaric rocket launcher south of Belgorod, Russia, near the Ukrainian border, on Saturday. And Oksana Markarova, Ukraine's ambassador to the United States, accused Russia of using vacuum bombs in its invasion. We have seen videos of Russian forces moving exceptionally lethal weaponry into Ukraine. That includes cluster munitions and vacuum bombs, the use of which directed against civilians is banned under the Geneva Conventions. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said in remarks at the UN Wednesday. It remains unclear whether Russia's use of the weapons so far would constitute war crimes, since that would depend on a legal question over the extent to which Russian forces minimized risk to civilians. A senior U.S. defense official, speaking on the condition of anonymity under ground rules set by the Biden administration, said Tuesday that Russia has launcher systems in Ukraine that could be used for a thermobaric weapon, but that U.S. officials could not confirm the presence or use of such weapons themselves in Ukraine. The Kremlin denied that the Russian military used cluster or vacuum munitions during the invasion. Here's what to know about the weapons, their legality and the threat they pose to civilians.